Senator Lindsey Graham has 73 co-sponsors on this bill to sanction Russian oil and anybody who buys Russian oil. He's making the pitch for the bill saying, why should China get the benefit of cheap oil from Russia as Putin continues the war? At some point, there has to be leverage on Putin, and I assume that you've talked about that.
Nobody uses leverage better than me. Look what I did to Iran. Look
so
what
it's
I did.
changing.
It's not changing.
Isn't it bad that he has to cite a different country as an example of leveraging pressure on the Russians? Oh, I use leverage. Great. Look at all these instances where it wasn't the Russians.
I always had that. I will use that if I have to. I'd rather not use that. By the way, that's a big deal. I just put it on Venezuela. It's secondary sanctions, it's called. And I just did it with Venezuela.
And you could do it with Iran, too.
I just did it with Iran. It's basically, if you buy oil from Iran, you can't do business with the United States. And you see the ships just leaving that port. You know, in Venezuela, it was amazing.
But why not do it with Russia?
You had to see the... Well, I will if I do. Honestly, I will.
He
if
will.
We're not going to make a deal.
He
we're
will.
Going to see whether or not...
Listen to that right there. He will. That is the important statement right there. He will if we're not able to make a deal. He will.
This is Turkey time. You know, this is now, we're talking Turkey. And we'll see what happens. That would be crushing for Russia because they're having a hard time now with the economy. Oil prices are low, you know.
It would change the dynamic.
Okay, so he's incompetent. He doesn't want to see the war. Because, you know, everything he said was wrong. The way he talked about Putin, the way he said the threats. I mean, you know,
We're done, and we're back to bashing Zelensky. We're back to bashing Zelensky. The journalist, just for a moment, allows him to float away to whatever topic he wants to, and we're already back to bashing Zelensky after he said, "We'll totally, you know, implement the sanctions if we're not able to get it to a deal. We'll totally do that." And it's a deal that, let me tell you, that many on the Ukrainian front line want. You know, when I talk to people on the front line, none of them were particularly hopeful. And I was on the Pokrovsk axis, so I was on one of the most violent axes. I went into Pokrovsk City. Many of them wanted a ceasefire. Many of them want to go home to their families. You know, some might have better rotation schedules than others. The people I was with, they had 3 days on the front, 3 days rotated away. Others have worse rotation schedules. Either way, if you've been fighting for over 3 years and at the start of the war you volunteered and now there's not enough manpower to really replace you, you still want to see your family too. And you don't want to be penalized for the fact you volunteered at the very start. And by right, somebody else should have probably taken up your position by now. There's people all across the front line of a variety of political reasons that would like to see a ceasefire succeed, if not just to give themselves a 30-day respite, if nothing else, for them to spend time with their family, celebrate birthdays, get you know, some medical help, whether it be mental or otherwise, and just, you know, be able to harden themselves for what might happen after, or prepare for what would be the best scenario, peace. The sad reality was, of course, though, that the entirety of this negotiation has happened under the backdrop of its almost certain failure. And it's almost certain failure not because it is impossible to successfully negotiate with the Russians. I talked to people of two varieties, both of them wrong, but in different ways. There's people who believed that all we had to do was sit down and talk, sit down and negotiate. I've talked to right-wingers of this persuasion. I've talked to progressives who have ran for Congress, who have been of this persuasion, for anybody who might remember that debate on the channel. I've talked to people of that persuasion all up and down. And then there was people on, I guess, that are much closer to my position, who are the idea that you can never trust the Russians, therefore you can never negotiate with them, which I feel is a flawed premise because it inherently implies that you have to trust somebody to negotiate with them, which I don't think is the case, as long as you put in strong enough deterrence in place where it's within the person's, even if you can't trust them's interest, not to engage or attack you in a way that's going to trigger that deterrence. i.e., you put some unilateral or multilateral defense pacts in place that would trigger if the Russians invaded again, as one example, or immediate secondary sanctions up and down the economic system, or a combination of both for the strongest version of deterrence. Either way, I didn't believe in either of these models. I believe that there is a way for you to negotiate with the Russians successfully here, but I don't believe that the White House has approached it from that pathway at all. They already set the goal high with, well, we're going to end it before I'm in office. Well, actually, we're going to end it in 24 hours, and that was the big promise. Well, actually, we're going to end it in our first 100 days, and that was the next promise. Well, actually, we're going to get a ceasefire by this date. Oh, well, actually, never mind. Maybe we shouldn't even be the ones to negotiate the ceasefire. And that's what we need to talk about now, which is after the Trump-Putin phone call, which came after the deadline that Trump and Europe and the coalition broadly supporting Ukraine put in place of last Thursday, which said that if the Russians had not engaged by a ceasefire at this point, we were going to trigger all these new sanctions. We're going to trigger a new wave of support for Ukraine. And I was in Pokrov City on Monday, which was the day that the ceasefire was supposed to take effect, and there was no ceasefire. I was woken up in the morning by glide bombs. That afternoon, our position was, hit very close by with Grad rocket fire. The whole day there was fighting. There was no ceasefire. And there continues to not be a ceasefire. This last weekend, we had a record-setting drone attack, the most drones attacking Kiev region for the entirety of the war. The most drones attacking the capital for the entirety of the war. You could see over the city. I had a great view from out here far off in the countryside. You could see the city lighting up all night as the air defense systems did their best to take down the drones, both in path to the city and over the city, and as the drones exploded by hitting their targets and exploded by being knocked out of the sky by the Shahed cowboys. Either way, it's clear that the Russians have been escalating offensive operations to the front. It's clear that the Russians are engaging in wider and larger scale air attacks against Ukraine, and due to the modernization of the Russian Air Force, particularly when it comes to its long-range bombers, it seems that they're going to be firing a lot of missiles and a lot of drones, definitely with their increased drone production we're seeing with these record-setting attacks towards Ukraine. The ceasefires that have been implemented by Trump have failed. They have all failed, whether it was the civilian ceasefire or the energy ceasefire, some of them failing within hours of the implementation. And so after the first failure of before being inaugurated, the second failure of 24 hours, the third failure of 100 days, the failure of the implemented ceasefires or the supposedly implemented ceasefires, now the failure of the 30-day ceasefires, the failures of the implementation of threats when it comes to secondary sanctions that Trump has been threatening since day one of his inauguration, but even further back onto the campaign trail. This was something that he talked about, not just sanctions, but actually getting more arms to the Ukrainians to scare the Russians to bring them to the negotiating table. And that's my point. My point isn't that negotiations were always doomed to fail. It's that even though they were always unlikely to succeed, but, hope is unconquerable. And I am of the belief that maybe under different circumstances, if what Russia was looking down of the barrel was not a dud, which was, well, no matter what I do, the United States will disengage, will walk away, and I'll just now have to deal with the Ukraine that has one less extremely powerful backer to support it. Instead, it would be looking down the barrel of maybe I should take this deal, or I'm going to deal with Ukraine being sent more aid, more aggressive sanction policies, and myself being shown on the world stage by my failure to engage with what was very favorable terms for the Russians, all things considered, considering their violations of international law, the crime of aggression, the brutality of the occupied territories. Instead of engaging with that and taking that, the world saw that they're not that interested in peace. And that is the only real benefit from the recent, well, there's only been really two benefits from recent waves of engagement. That one, where the world community, whether it be Turkey and Ankara, or whether it be across the Gulf states, it's pretty clear it's Russia that is the holdup on peace. And the other benefit is the engagement that has brought about more prisoner transfers. But let's talk about the Trump-Putin phone call. Okay, let's go through those details, because I'm sure many of you guys are just snapping at the bit, waiting for the details of the Trump-Putin phone call. So let's bring it up. I got the details up here on the other screen. So the thing is, they talked for about over 2 hours, and according to Kremlin sources, and that means those from the Russian side that were listening in on the call, they say that they were actually getting along so well in this call that neither could decide who to hang up on, that who should be the person to hang up. Now, when it comes to the actual substance of the call, Donald Trump immediately afterwards said progress was made. Now, if you guys was to ask what that progress was, we don't really have an answer. And when it comes to documentable, here is the concession we've gotten, here's how closer we are to peace. Are we any closer to, say, even the time frame of listing out a ceasefire? So, hey, maybe we'll have a ceasefire in a month, or maybe we'll have a ceasefire in 2 months. Well, Russian sources told Steve Rosenberg of the BBC, no, they have no time frame. No time frame was worked on during the meeting. No time frame was mentioned during the meeting. And so Trump has now come forward with a call for Russia and Ukraine to have direct talks where they could negotiate a start to negotiations, which then could lead to the ceasefire. So to negotiate a ceasefire. So we've gone from you have to implement the ceasefire as a platform, as a basis by which talks can succeed from, because when the guns are firing, it's a lot harder to bring about peace than when the guns have been silent, and you can negotiate and you can, bring about some settlement. But now they're saying clearly that how about no on the 30-day ceasefire? How about instead we'll talk about the terms and the core issues that can be discussed to bring about a resolution, at first a ceasefire, which will then bring about a peace deal. And when they talk about core issues, these are going to be things like the regions Russia has announced the annexation of but have not conquered, like Kherson and Zaporizhia, the Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, etc. It's going to be issues like demilitarization, which they announced at the very start of the war, and is going to, of course, be a non-starter from Kiev for them to agree to demilitarize after 2 illegal invasions in a 12-year period. Would seem like national self-emulation. You're just hurting yourself at the national level in clear view of everybody. Of course, there is the demands by Russia to get rid of the illegitimate government. They call for it through to elections, but at the end of the day, if Zelensky was to win another term, I don't think they'd be happy. Russia's issue with Ukraine is not its democratic principles or its society. It is the fact that it has a government that is willing to stand up for its sovereignty over their impairment of their nationhood. So these core issues, many of them non-negotiables, both for the future of European security, because other nation states don't want to incentivize this type of Russian behavior, but also just for the Ukrainian people across the board. They're not going to give the city Kherson, which is having the human safari go on in it, over to the Russians. And so addressing these core issues before ceasefire can happen, it suggests to me that until there are big concessions that are not going to be willing to be made by the Ukrainians, especially after so many previous concessions about, well, it seems that the Americans have decided for us no NATO membership. Well, it seems that the Americans have decided for us that these first waves of negotiations, we won't be at the table. Well, it seems that the Americans have decided that there will not be any American troops in Ukraine, acting as a deterrent from Ukraine's strongest supposed ally. Anyway, there is no immediate start to a ceasefire. There is instead now Trump calling for an opportunity to negotiate for a ceasefire. If you're curious about whether or not I'm framing this incorrectly, we can just read Trump's post. Try to take out the garbage, just like dribble. And I don't mean to be mean. I just mean to say that Trump just kind of says a lot of words that are unimportant for trying to dissect policy. Just completed my 2-hour phone call with President Vladimir Putin. I believe it went very well. Sadly, many politicians for many eons have reacted very bitterly, and that's been their main political skill. I believe it went very well. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire. Great. So what was all of this? What was all this pressure campaign? What was Trump saying? I'm going to implement sanctions if they don't agree to a ceasefire. And now it's like, well, how about we start talking about a ceasefire? More importantly, an end to the war. The conditions for that will be negotiated between the two parties, as it can only be, because they know the details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. Unless you're informed. You don't have to be in Ukraine to know about Ukraine. The tone and spirit of the conversation were excellent. If it wasn't, I would say so now rather than later. Russia wants to do large scale trade with the United States when this catastrophic bloodbath is over. And I agree. Again, no words about getting us closer to peace, but he is talking about moving us closer to trade with the Russians. There is a tremendous opportunity for Russia to create massive amounts of jobs and wealth. Its potential is unlimited. Likewise, Ukraine can be a great beneficiary on trade in the process of rebuilding its country. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will begin immediately. I have so informed President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, President Emmanuel Macron of France, President of Italy, uh, the Prime Minister of Italy, Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany, and President Alexander Stubb of Finland during a call with me immediately after the phone call. The Vatican, as represented by the Pope, has stated that it would be very interested in hosting negotiations. Let the process begin. So, the way that I read this, and this is the way that the Financial Times read it too, and that other in the phone call after the meeting between Putin and Trump had, you mean the European officials and such, was that the U.S. is basically bowing out as a mediator. And him talking about the Pope at the end here is him legitimately suggesting that the new Pope, Pope Leo, should take up as the new mediator here, and the United States should drop that role. By the way, there were no announcements of sanctions because there will be no sanctions implemented. Trump has also been directly asked by the press about this, about sanctions being implemented, and he said no because he still believed there was a chance for success when it comes to negotiations. Now, this is after nearly 140 days when he said it would be over before he was even inaugurated. And we're still at the phase of how about we negotiate a ceasefire after a few days ago we were in the position of, hey, give us the ceasefire or we'll do XYZ. Now we're not doing XYZ. And now we're saying, okay, how about we negotiate a ceasefire? We're actively going backwards. We're actively going backwards from our policy goals and priorities. Actively going backwards. And so it seems that Trump is probably of the opinion that running this gauntlet forever while he goes on interviews with Brett Baer and he's going to be asked, okay, you said sanctions, when sanctions, when sanctions, when sanctions. And his immediate defensive reaction is, Zelensky is issue in trouble. He can't do that forever. He can't do that when polled over 60% of Americans still want to send aid to Ukraine, when the majority of Americans think that he's not handling Ukraine well, the majority of Americans think that he's not handling Russia well, and the vast majority of Americans, including many of his own supporters, have no trust, no faith that this process being taken upon by Donald Trump is going to end with an actual ceasefire and then, more importantly, peace settlement. And so I think he doesn't want to do that gauntlet forever. So he'd rather pass the issue over to the Pope and then try to wash his hands of the situation. Now, it's kind of hard to wash your hands of the situation when you declared so much that you were going to end it, and that if it's an end upon your wishes, then you were going to get more involved and send more aid and implement more sanctions. And now your reaction is to tell the Russians, hey, end the war or we'll stop supporting Ukraine and do nothing. It's not really a big disincentive. If anything, some people might even call it an incentive to wait the United States out, knowing that the longer they wait, the less and less aid Ukraine is going to be seeing from the United States, because Ukraine is not being approved any more aid packages. Everything being sent from the United States now is stuff that was approved during the Biden administration. And it's part of the reason why I assume the Ukrainians, while of course they want engagement from the United States, part of the reason why I think they've been so muted and part of the response is because they know Trump could still try to freeze those future shipments that have already been approved by the last administration and Congress.
Using this excuse to gives you money. Is there a possibility, Liddy, that they are even negotiating? Like Trump telling his public differs in process?
Not really, no. I don't believe so. And the reason why is it says explicitly here that Trump wants Ukraine and Putin to negotiate. So he didn't go in there saying, this is the plan, you're going to do it, or I'm going to punish you, or I'm going to punish you if you don't do it. Because if that was the case, he'd be coming out here to be pushing something. He doesn't. He just says that they should negotiate because they know the details no one else can know. Now, that's silly to say that Ukraine is to go from I can end it in 24 hours to saying it's so complicated. Nobody in the world but the Ukrainians and the Russians themselves can understand the mysterious Russian soul in that mystical land of Ukraine, right? It is ridiculous, but that all implies to me that there is no secret negotiations going on in the background. Everybody that was saying that Trump was playing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9D chess, once again, they were shown to be completely full of it because he wasn't. There was never any secret Ukraine peace negotiation that was going on behind closed doors. There was never any secret plan that Trump had. There was never any secret pressure campaign that recent guests on my program that I debated suggested that, oh, Trump is actually through the oil prices and XYZ. No. There really doesn't seem to be any coordinated pressure campaign on the Russians of any fashion whatsoever. Everything that has been used as pressure against the Russians is not stuff that I've even seen Trump use. It's just stuff that has stayed in place because Congress put it in place, and Trump doesn't have the ability to reel it back in without them. Not saying he won't try anyway. It's not like he's really ever respected Congress's authority all that much. Thank you for the $20. Now, so that's what we got from Donald Trump. We got from Donald Trump walking back on his position about responding to the Russians with sanctions, and once again taking the goalposts on Ukraine, and for I think like the 6th or 7th time now, moving it across the football field. Now we move over to Putin. If you were to try to find any signs of success for ceasefire talks or peace deals, if you were to actually decide I'm going to go down this Trump tunnel, Putin said after the conversation that they can see that, they could see a possible future peace treaty. A possible future peace treaty. Let me give you this quote. The U.S. expressed its position on a ceasefire. I expressed my interest in a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. This is all very purposefully vague. And it's all purposely vague because a possible future peace treaty puts both the peace treaty in the future, meaning it's not now, it's not immediate, there's no rush for them to go out there and stop the fighting and stop the bloodshed. To stop the bloodshed, as Trump keep putting it, there's no rush. And by putting possible in there, you put the whole thing in and of itself up in the air. You put it all up to question. Well, will there even be this peace treaty? I mean, it's going to be in the future if it does happen, but will it even happen? I don't know. I mean, the U.S. has expressed its position, but in a quote, I expressed my interest in a peaceful settlement. So he has an interest in a peaceful settlement. Putin has an interest, not a commitment. He has an interest in a peaceful settlement. When is that peaceful settlement? That's not said. It's all so purposely vague that makes it very easy for me to believe, definitely since Trump didn't announce no timeline, that Kremlin lackey who sat in on the meeting and said that no timeline has been announced. And there actually was some writing in the Russian state press about it being purposely vague for this purpose. So it's not like this is completely lost on the Russian political sphere. Yuri Yushchenkov, Putin's foreign policy advisor, he was the one, by the way, who is on the record on saying that the meeting was so friendly that neither leader wanted to be the first one to put down the phone. I wanted to also play some footage of what JD Vance had to say at the time, because as all this information's coming out, he has to be the one to go out there and play defense for the administration. Let me show you what he said. We should be able to move beyond the mistakes that have been made in the past. If Russia's not willing to do that, then they're eventually just going to say, this is not our war, it's Joe Biden's war. Listen to this. This is JD Vance attempting to play bad cop, which the fact that he's attempting to do that already shows you the wacky state of this administration.
I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin has a strategy. I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin has a strategy himself for how to unwind the war, of course, that's been going on for a few years now. And I think there's also just a little bit of, look, there's fundamental mistrust between Russia and the West. It's one of the things the president thinks is frankly stupid, that we should be able to move beyond the mistakes that have been made in the past, but that takes two to tango. I know the president's willing to do that, but if Russia's not willing to do that, then we're eventually just going to have to say, this is not our war. It's Joe Biden's war. It's Vladimir Putin's war. It's not our war. We're going to try to end it, but if we can't end it, we're eventually going to say, you know what, that was worth a try, but we're not doing it anymore.
Okay, so here's the incentive structure. Russia, either you come to these ceasefire talks and you end the bloodshed, or we'll stop being involved and not send any more aid or implement any new sanctions. The clock is ticking, bucko. The incentive would be to wait you out. Just wait for you to walk out of the room. Wait for you to lose interest, which is a stereotype about the United States that Trump is very much fulfilling, as he is the incarnate of a leader who cannot keep his eye on the ball and gets distracted very, very easily. I think the rumors about the difficulty of getting him to pay attention during the daily brief and choosing what type of bullet point to keep his eye, I think that there's almost certainly some truth to it. Almost certainly some truth to it. Let me read you a few readouts from the Financial Times article, by the way. It is crucial for all of us that the United States does not distance itself from talks in the pursuit of peace, because the only one who benefits from that is Putin. That right there is a quote that the Financial Times wanted to point out of Zelensky, and they followed this quote up. Listen to this specific statement. This is not a quote from Zelensky, this is a quote from them. The call confirmed the European leaders' worst fears, that the U.S. president, seduced by Putin's blandishments, was ready to pivot to Moscow and sell out Kiev. This is the Financial Times. This is not some rag. This is not a very pro-Ukraine publication, some nationalist publication. This is the Financial Times saying that Trump is pivoting to Moscow to sell out to Kiev for long-term business interests once the war is over, that he would like to see the war end merely so he could no longer have that barrier in the way of his business interests. At least that seems to be what he's primarily moving forward on when it comes to negotiations with the Russians and bilateral talks. And look, he says that we're not going to implement these sanctions in part because we don't have all the information to know that it's, that the Russians aren't really serious about engaging. If they're still talking about negotiating, they're not that serious. But let me read you some of the Russian state press. I think that, it's one thing to talk about what Putin said in a private phone call. Let's see what they're preparing the Russian public for. Let's see what the big Russian state publications are saying. Izvestia. This is known as Russia's national newspaper. It was founded back in 1917. Long history. This is a piece by Oleg Karpovich. This is the vice rector for Russia's foreign ministry's diplomatic academy. So this is somebody who is affiliated with the administration, or at least, the government. Of course, the continuation of diplomatic efforts must not be accompanied by a drop in efforts to liberate Russian regions and denazify and demilitarize what is left of Ukraine. Sooner or later, Russia opponents will have to realize once and for all that if they don't want to talk to Medsky is the person who the Russians said sent to Turkey both in 2022 and 2025, and he was the one who made the assertion that, oh, how long are you going to fight? We fought the Swedes for 21 years. We can fight for however long. I mean, if we keep fighting, though, some of your loved ones at this table, they might die in combat and war and, XYZ. If they're not willing to talk to Medsky, the conversation will be with Oreshnik missiles. This applies not only to the puppets in Kiev, but their bosses who, seized by a parody of Bonapartism, are trying to launch a new round of hybrid wars against Moscow. We are ready for that. Moskovotsi Komsomolets, founded in 1919. It was Putin who proposed these talks in Turkey, but the conditions that were originally issued to him for starting the talks, he managed to successfully ignore. 30-day ceasefire, Putin's participation, and the participation of the American mediators. Here is another article from the same publication. Trump's readiness for compromise and constructive relations with Moscow is an important resource and an important achievement in modern Russian foreign policy. If there is a chance to preserve and cement this achievement without sacrificing our principal and fundamental interests. Now, if you guys would be surprised to hear that after the Putin-Trump meeting, the Russian state outlets like Izvestia and Komsomolets, they were actually quite happy. They consider it a success for Putin. They consider it a success because they are able to avoid more sanctions. They are able to avoid more support for Ukraine, and they are able to continue to drag this conversation on with no pause that the Ukrainians could use to reinforce themselves from their perspective. So from their view, there's no rush. There's no rush to negotiate. There's no rush to bring about peace. There is no rush to deliver on any of Trump's demands of civilian ceasefires, energy ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, fulfilling his 24-hour timeline, his timeline before, his 100-day timeline. There's no incentive because they don't think there is going to be any negative response. And Marco Rubio's attempts to convince the Russians, I think, through public diplomacy, that even if Donald Trump himself isn't willing to pull the trigger on the response, that the Senate, through a coalition, a bipartisan coalition of Republican and Democratic senators and congresspeople, will pass a bipartisan veto-proof aid package to implement secondary sanctions. I think that Putin is of the belief that Trump will do his best to snuff it out if necessary, and that, it's not a real deterrent, that at the end of the day, Trump doesn't want to pull the trigger on it. And so far, they've been proven right, at least on not pulling the trigger so far. Trump talked about these sanctions since day one. Trump talked about these sanctions since the campaign trail, and he's currently saying no sanctions because of a no timeline possible commitment for the Ukrainians and the Russians just to keep talking. Not that, like the Russians actively talk about in their press, they can keep fighting and talking at the same time. Why can't we implement sanctions, implement more pressure to create the conditions that would make the Russians want to come and seriously talk about ending the war, and not just talk about it in, hypotheticals. Now, I want to go over some key points over this. I want to go through the ringer one last time, okay? To make sure we don't miss any details. Number one, we're no closer to peace. This deadline that Trump and Europe put forward, it passed. I was on the front during the ceasefire deadlines. None of them succeeded. There was no ceasefire. So we're no closer to peace, let alone a ceasefire. And Trump saying that there was progress without detailing the progress, and then saying the Russians and the Ukrainians could talk to each other, as if that wasn't something that could, the main problem here is simply that the Ukrainians and the Russians haven't expressed themselves clearly. because that's not the problem with negotiating here. And if that's not the problem, maybe it's not as simple as just those two talking. Okay, so we're no closer to peace, let alone a ceasefire. The 30-day ceasefire demand is, from Trump at least, dead. This was, in my mind, a decent enough demand. I think that, of course, the demand could be tougher, but it basically said that, look, in order to show that you're serious about ceasefire, you need to implement a ceasefire. And in order to show you're serious about peace, you need to have a ceasefire, because the best way to build peace is through, a peaceful foundation, through a ceasefire. It also fulfills his campaign promise of ending the killing. He said he wanted to end the killing quickly, and the only way to do that was through a ceasefire. He failed to do that, and now he's dropping the demand for a 30-day ceasefire basically entirely. Even though 1 week ago he was saying that he would implement sanctions if they did not agree to it, now he's saying they should negotiate a ceasefire, period. And we do hear that, and I did hear that in the meeting, that the Russians were trying to say, oh, the Ukrainians attacked us during Victory Day. That shows that they're not that dedicated to the ceasefire. And if anybody knew that the Ukrainians never agreed to the Victory Day ceasefire, and also that the Russians didn't adhere to the Victory Day ceasefire, and also that the Russians violated their own previous ceasefires that they had committed to, then somebody with that knowledge might be able to tell Trump in there and say, oh, I don't know this is the case. But when Trump comes out and says, "Oh, the only ones who could truly know it are the people themselves," I think part of it is, it's an out, it's an easy out. But I think part of it is also just actual laziness. Either way, the 30-day demand has been dropped. Now it's just a question about negotiating towards a ceasefire, instead of using a ceasefire as a platform for future negotiations. And Putin's aide did say that a timeline for a ceasefire wasn't even discussed, so we have no clue when the future that's going to be. And from the way JD Vance and Trump is talking, I don't think there's any time frame. There's also no echoes of previous demands to trade land for land. During the start of this, in the first few weeks, Trump came out and said that he would try to negotiate as much of Ukraine's land back as possible. He then applied no pressure, and surprisingly, he got no land in exchange for his no pressure. And so none of those gains have been made. None of those gains have been announced. And it seems from the way that the Trump administration is talking that goal has been dropped by the administration. American credibility has been shot. Now, American credibility has had a lot of issues, whether it had to do with previous commitments being made to the SDF being undercut in the famous Kurd betrayals, whether it has to do with interpreters and other Afghans being undercut, whether it has to do with people that we told that, they could get asylum in our country. We're now, saying, hey, well, even though you did everything right, we're going to boom, 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 never mind. Whether it's the principles we claim to hold around freedom of expression being tested on college campuses and with deportation, there's a lot of areas where credibility has been shot, but our security credibility is extremely important. And if we're telling the Ukrainians we're with them till the end, and we're telling the Ukrainians before that to give up their atomic weapons, something like this won't happen, and if it does, we'll be there, and then we're there, but then we're not there. And then we say we're going to be there, but then we're not there, both recently and before. You're hurting American credibility. People are placing themselves in the shoes of Ukraine thinking, what is it like to be an American ally? This is what it's like to be an American ally. They have a short attention span, unreliable, pull the rug from out under you. And as soon as it doesn't profit them, as soon as their greed gets in the way, they're going to act like a snake. This might not all be true about every American. The majority of Americans still support aid to Ukraine, over 60% from recent polling, not old polling, recent polling. So this might not be true of every American, but this is true of the man who won the White House. And this perception of the United States as an uncredible security partner is going to lead to policy changes from things as, high-ranking decisions about, bases and the future of their nation's trade relationship with the United States, security relationship with the United States, to everything down to defense procurement and military budgets. Walking away is a strategy that only benefits Russia. I want to redouble this for the JD Vance quote. I want to redouble this for the Trump administration floating this. I think it would look bad for them, after being so bold on ending the war quickly. I think it would be bad for America's national security interests, but also by putting this out there about how willing you are to walk away, do this thing that again only benefits the Russians. The Russians are working towards an outcome that sees your peace efforts fail, that sees Trump's efforts to get a Nobel Peace Prize be doomed from the start. Why concede anything if America simply does not care? So then I'm left with two sets of questions, okay? And these are the things that I want you guys to be going home with. Number one, are the sanctions that the Senate demanded, that they said were going to be going in place if they didn't agree to the ceasefire, right? And that knockoff Kissinger, Marco Rubio, said would be triggered without, it's something we can't stop. He said it's something we can't stop. It was an immovable force. It is a force of nature. It is like the tides itself. It is something we can't stop. Well, now Trump is saying that he wants to stop it. Trump is saying he doesn't want the sanctions put in place because who knows, maybe a peace deal can somehow succeed in the way it hasn't so far. Maybe, a wish upon a star or a sudden strike of conscience in the heart of the Russian leader. Will these sanctions still be triggered anyway? Are they going to be triggered like they said? Is that threat of the sanctions can't be controlled going to be delivered upon? Or is the credibility of Congress, which is already ranked terribly low by the American public when it comes to approval, going to further shoot their credibility and show that they are willing to fall in line behind Trump against America's key national security commitments and America's declared statements? Because it's not just Trump that represents the United States, it's also all these Congress people that represent the United States. And when the United States makes a commitment, they are representatives of that commitment. And another set of questions, if this is the path that we're going down, that the United States is not going to approve any more aid packages, that we're not going to get any large-scale sanction packages on the Russians, is the United States going to try to keep it as it is now, have the sanctions that stay in place, saying we'll remove them if you stop invading Ukraine, so they can say, look, that's some form of incentive that we're offering, because they can do that without any relative strong damage or really substantial damage to the American economy. And also, you would need to challenge Congress in order to get rid of those sanctions. And so, since the majority there is not certain in trying to remove it, I think Trump is probably going to. There's a good chance that he's going to choose this pathway. I would even say probably. But if they choose that pathway, are they going to just disengage like they're saying? Or are they going to hinder Europe? Are they going to tell Europe that in order to get XYZ thing from the United States, they have to agree to this new peace initiative after all the rest of them have failed, but the United States still wants to play patty cake with the Russians? Or are they going to tell allies of Ukraine that they cannot re-export American exports or American technology like the United States tried to do with the Abrams that the Australians were going to destroy, but then the Australians went ahead and sent over to the Ukrainians anyway? Are they going to try to hinder them in that way? Or if, for example, and this is one pathway that Europe could try to take in order to continue to support Ukraine, using Europe's coffers to buy American weapons for themselves and then transferring their current weapons or these new ones to the Ukrainians, probably faster to transfer what they already have on hand. Will the United States allow the re-export of these arms to Kiev? So are we getting disengagement or are we getting undermining? From the way that Keith Kellogg talked, which is supposed to be one of the more balanced heads in the administration who knows the region, can speak Russian, he talked about Ukraine as a barnyard animal that needed to be beaten into submission by the cutting off of aid. I am not so sure. No closer to peace. 30-day ceasefire seems dead. No echoes of demands on land. American credibility shot. Walking away is a strategy that only benefits the Russians. The sanctions from the Senate, where are they? And is the United States just going to disengage, or are they going to undermine? This is what I'm left thinking about. Okay, Now that we threw out some information out there, before we move on to the next subject, which we're going to in a moment, do we have any questions from chat? I'm looking at YouTube chat right now.